pro-social pressures on information exchange within information ecosystems are guided by this rationale of creating the greater good. Limitations placed on information exchange are always at least pro forma justified by reference to the greater good that those limitations create as opposed to a lack of limitations. We don't find any such noble rationales when we turn to the anti-social pressures on information. Indeed, the three that we're going to talk about can be thought of as the trifecta of repressive dictatorships. Antisocial pressures that limit the flow of information ecosystems occur when organizations or institutions or governments attempt to undermine or limit or corrupt information exchange within an ecosystem. And they do this with a very specific intent, but the intent is not beneficent. They do it in order to benefit some members of society or groups of society at the expense of other members. So it's a selfish rationale behind these exchanges. Now, the first of these antisocial pressures is information suppression or censorship. And this has long been a staple of repressive governments to go in and limit the information that people have access to, or to make it difficult for people to have access to information they don't want them to have. And they do this systematically with the intent to deprive people of information in order to repress, control, or otherwise manipulate them. And so oftentimes you'll see governments that want to hold on to power by engaging in these acts of massive censorship. So, for example, one famous instance of this is China. China has such an enormous and far-reaching effort to censor their internet, for instance, that it has a moniker. Right? The Chinese have the Great Firewall of China. There is so much information censorship there that it's a giant firewall, as if it were the same thing as the wall that protected part of China from invading foreign forces. So the Chinese government engages in these really dramatic censorship efforts. So one example of this that we talk about in the chapter here is that the Chinese government recently banned Winnie the Pooh because memes on the internet made unfavorable comparisons between Winnie the Pooh and the current president of China, and he didn't like these, and hence it became a problem. At one point, they actually banned the letter N in China. So this kind of active suppression of information for the purposes of maintaining political power, repressing, controlling, or otherwise manipulating a populace has a very, very long history. So, for instance, in 1933, Joseph Goebbels gave an address in which he said that it was the absolute right of the state to supervise, quote unquote, the formation of public information. The idea here is that insofar as the state can control what you see or hear, or the spin or slant upon what you see or hear, then they have this leverage to control what you think. They can repress you, they can control you, they can manipulate them. Now, the typical tools of information suppression include a dominant state-run media, prohibiting independent media, imprisoning journalists, murdering or allowing the murder of journalists, restricting internet access, restricting access to the popular press, monitoring and censoring the internet, and in general, sort of government or authoritative harassment of people who are trying to disseminate information the government doesn't want people to know. So, for instance, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 10 countries in 2016 had the highest rate of impunity for murdering journalists. And here's the diagram from that report. So number one that year was Somalia, followed by Iraq, followed by Syria, the Philippines, South Sudan, Mexico, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Brazil, and then Russia. As a general indication of the scope of worldwide threats to journalists, the Committee to Protect Journalists recently reported that 251 journalists were imprisoned in 2018. 60 journalists were missing, and 54 journalists were killed in cases where the CJP confirms the repressive motives. Among the 54 murders that year was the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was brutally murdered after entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. Freedom House, which is another watchdog organization, reports that only 13% of the world's population enjoys a free press, which they define as a media environment where coverage of political news is robust, the safety of journalists is guaranteed, state intrusion into media affairs is minimal, and the press is not subject to onerous legal or economic pressures. So these kinds of mechanisms and tools of censorship are common at governmental levels. There are also other sorts of censorship mechanisms that have emerged relatively recently. So, for instance, these mandatory non-disclosure agreements that people have to sign when they get a judgment or when they engage in some sort of severance from their business and so on. These oftentimes prohibit them from discussing in any way, shape, or form what happened or what went on. So, for example, I had a student tell me that in order to work on the docks in Germany, he had to sign a non-disclosure form so that he wouldn't tell the sorts of things that were going on the docks to other people. Now, not all censorship is bad. Some censorship occurs, for instance, during time of war. Some non-disclosure agreements are intended to prevent sensitive information from being leaked after a person leaves an organization and so on. But oftentimes they are used to control information, to keep people from finding out what's going on within an organization or a country and so on.